my friends, yes, welcome to another episode of Nintendo Nightcap, bringing you all the latest Nintendo news, and today we've got a humongous rumor for you. It comes via Zach from Switch Force, who is speculating that Resident Evil Requiem could be coming over to the Switch 2 and could even be announced and demoed at Gamescom next week. So we're going to get into that. And then I've got some tidbits of information from my source who was telling me that Nintendo of Japan is going to be over at Gamescom themselves. But why are they going to be there? We're going to speculate and talk about that as well. But before we jump into these stories, my friends, why don't you consider hitting that like and subscribe? Helps the channel out plenty. And then pull out a seat right here next to me as we talk about the first story of the day, which has to, of course, be the potential that Resident Evil Requiem might be coming over to the Switch 2. Yes, the game which is out early 2026, the game that is so advanced, so extensive, could it even run on the Switch 2? Well, that is what Zach from Switch Force has been saying, because he has received some information from his own source and some pictures of the setup of Gamescom, which shows the Capcom area of Resident Evil Requiem, and underneath the main sign are some Switch 2 demo stations, and he speculates what they could be showing. Will they be indeed Resident Evil Requiem, or could it just be older Resident Evil games? That is what Zach is speculating. But in fact, why don't we hear exactly what he said, and then we'll talk about it. So this is what he said.
So what I've seen is the setup for Gamescom, and they're setting up the show floor. We know opening night live is on Tuesday, and then the show floor should kick off after that for the rest of the week. It's a big show, tons of people go, millions of people go. Maybe not millions, hundreds of thousands of people go. It's very packed. But at the Resident Evil Requiem setup, okay, there's a big sign for Resident Evil Requiem, which is Resident Evil 9. We know it's releasing in early 2026, possibly my most anticipated game. And it's something I've said should come to Switch 2 because we should be getting all these big new games, right? Resident Evil games have been on Switch 1 in a cloud version, which, not gonna settle for that. We need a cartridge-based Resident Evil Requiem. And in this photo, they are building Switch 2 demo stations right in front of the Resident Evil Requiem sign, okay? So, take that for what you will. I take that to mean there's a darn good chance that Resident Evil Requiem is going to be revealed for Nintendo Switch 2 at Gamescom, okay? Which is huge. That would be monumental, and it would show that a very high-powered, big game that we know already looks beautiful and is one of the most anticipated titles of 2026 is coming to our home system. Nintendo Switch 2. We can take it on the go, we can play it at home, and hopefully it runs pretty darn good. That would be a great endorsement from Capcom because, look, they didn't bring us Monster Hunter Wilds. They didn't feel like that was a fit for the Switch 2. I'm still currently shocked over that. But RE9 coming to Switch 2 would be a great sign for not only Capcom titles, but for everybody else, right? All the others in the area of third-party AAA titles being like, dude, Capcom can do it, we can do it. Nintendo is talking, securing, and locking up big multi-platform titles, and that's huge, right? That's not an old game, that's not a cloud version, that's Resident Evil Requiem, which is going to be so freaking sick if it's anything like 7 or 8, and I'm insanely pumped for it. Now, I will tell you that the only other thing I could think of this being, right, again, big stage of Resident Evil Requiem, Nintendo Switch 2 demo stations, are they bringing older versions of Resident Evil to the Switch 2, and they're just using that stage and that area as sort of the grounds to demo these titles, right? That's something that could be as well. Like, could Capcom walk up and be like, come play Resident Evil 9 Requiem on PlayStation 5, and then demo Resident Evil Village on Switch 2? They could.
So my friends, very interesting news there indeed from Zach from Switch Force. And as he says right there, he is basically saying he has seen a picture showing the entire setup of Resident Evil Requiem with underneath the main sign showing multiple Switch 2 demo stations. Now, when I first heard this, I must admit, I went over to the other option which Zach gives us, which is the possibility that rather than it being stations for Resident Evil 9, it could be that we are going to be getting the older Resident Evil games on the Switch 2, and those are the ones that are going to be displayed on those demo stations, namely Resident Evil 7, Village, 3 Nemesis, and maybe even Resident Evil 4 Remake. So that's what I think could be the more likely outlook for this. But it's not to say that there's definitely no chance Resident Evil Requiem could be headed over to the Switch 2, and in fact, that is what is being demoed or will be demoed this week. Of course, Resident Evil is no stranger at all to appearing on Nintendo hardware. We had them all the way back on the N64 with Resident Evil 2. We had every Resident Evil at the time on the GameCube. The Wii had Resident Evil 4. The Wii U had Resident Evil Revelations. The 3DS had Resident Evil Revelations. And of course, on the Switch, we had the cloud editions of 7, Village, and 2 and 3 as well. So Capcom loves putting its Resident Evil games on Nintendo hardware. I have no doubt we will be getting 7, 8, 3, 4 on the Switch 2, not cloud editions, but actual physical editions. But where does that leave Resident Evil 9? Do I think that it's going to appear on the Switch 2? I would like to think it will at some point. But the other thing that makes me doubt it is that all the games that we are seeing for the Switch 2 at Gamescom are games that have been announced by Nintendo already, whether that's Elden Ring, Borderlands, Metroid, whatever. And Resident Evil Requiem would be such a huge game that I would find it weird Nintendo wouldn't want to announce it at the rumored forthcoming Direct in September instead. Nintendo's been very precious about keeping developers under its wraps and making them be very quiet about what they're releasing on the Switch 2. And so Resident Evil 9 or Requiem doesn't come much bigger than that game. So I feel like Nintendo would rather have that in a Direct. Now, does that make it impossible? No. It still could be appearing at Gamescom, and that would be massive. That would dominate the news that week. The other bit of information I've received from my source says that Nintendo of Japan themselves are going to be at Gamescom, and they are going to be, in their words, monitoring the situation with third parties, i.e. third-party games, the reaction to third-party games. And maybe if this Resident Evil Requiem on Switch 2 is correct, and that is the game in fact being demoed on those Switch 2 demo stations, then maybe that makes sense, and maybe that corresponds to the fact that Nintendo of Japan will be at Gamescom, and maybe they want to see how the reactions to that game are indeed. So very interesting bits of information we're getting here now in the run-up to Gamescom, which is going to kick off on Tuesday. But that is the news. That's what I've heard from my source. Nintendo of Japan is going to be at Gamescom, and they are keen on monitoring the situation with third parties specifically. They might even be there in order to talk to third parties, but they're very keen to monitor the reaction that third-party games on their system will be getting. Now, does that align with Resident Evil Requiem? We'll have to wait and see, but it could well be. But that is all the information I have for today, my good friends. I've had no sleep. In fact, I'm going to be editing this video on my way to work. But let me know in the comments what you think. Is it possible that Resident Evil Requiem will be coming to the Switch 2? Is it too ambitious? Could it even run on the console? I think it can. But I want to hear what you guys think. And what do you think Nintendo of Japan is going to be doing at Gamescom? What is the reason for their visit? We'll have to wait and see. Anyways, I will be back tomorrow with all the latest Nintendo news. Until then, my good friends, have yourselves an awesome day, and I'll catch you soon. Bye.